Okay, what I thought we'd do, well, we've got a few things today. Most importantly, we have Chara's presentation on the personality, I think, of Edward III. We'll have that in the second half of the class. And by way of introduction, I will start talking about the reign of Henry III in this hour, and we will finish looking at Henry III's reign and looking at the documents relating to the Barons' Revolt on Tuesday next week. We'll put those two bits together in a way. But to start us off today, I want to spend a few minutes on the essays, though half the class isn't here. But anyway, it's what I planned, so we shall do that. So firstly, as a reminder, should you need reminding, next week on Tuesday, I would like to receive drafts, which means not completely final, although it would be nice if it was perceived in that way, but something relatively substantial which shows me what you're doing, what you're writing, and so on. Okay, a fairly full thing that I can then comment on, identify any possible problems, and then you will have just under a month. We said final submission deadline is the 11th of January, so that will give you about a month to work on them. I will try and give them back, no, it'll give you less than a month. I'll give them back on the 29th, the following Tuesday, if I haven't had time to look at them by Thursday next week. So it gives you about 3 weeks or so. So let's say a little bit about what I'm expecting now. Cengiz has already given his paper in, so if the things I start saying he thinks, well, I didn't do that, and I didn't do that, it's a bit late now anyway. Well, actually, when are you leaving? When are you actually... Right, okay, so you could in theory, though you've got your Latin and so on to prepare for,
yeah,
but...
I was going to leave Friday, but I decided to keep
Yeah, fair enough. You need to give a little leeway here and there. So I'll talk about a few very, very general things, and this is particularly because most of the people in the class are actually not Bilkent history students. We have archaeologists and we have people from non-historical departments, so it might be useful for me to say, it's not really about history essays, but just essay writing in general, but in partly what I'm looking for as well. And then obviously that'll give you some very broad ideas that might help you prepare. So, firstly, I consulted the syllabus, and it said I'm expecting something in the region of about 4,000 words, which I estimate is over 10 pages of kind of a Word document, either 1.5 or double spacing. I don't know if this seems a lot to those of you who are not history graduates. It doesn't seem that much to me, and it is the only kind of formal written thing that you're doing this semester, so it seems a reasonable amount to ask for. The equivalent course that I teach every other year, Paul, my colleague, teaches it this year, and I teach it, I'll be doing it next year, Medieval Europe. I asked for 2 papers there of about this kind of a length, and that's quite a good process, because then we can spot the mistakes in the first one and then move towards solving them later on. But anyway, about 4,000 words, something in the region of 9, 10, 11 pages would be acceptable. And that's not something that you should get completely hung up on. It's not something which you think, oh, I have to aim for this number of words and I'm only 3,924 words, so somehow I'm 76 words under the limit and David's going to get upset. It's more by way of saying, to write something which is reasonably substantial and that does a number of things and achieves what an essay should do, at this kind of a level, though you're all at kind of slightly different levels, obviously, but to achieve those things, then I think something hitting 10 pages would be minimal, in a sense, will be just about enough. If you end up writing something which is kind of 6 or 7 pages, then something must be missing, in my opinion. Obviously, it depends on the subject, and you can go along and go into lots of detail and make something far too long, which is what I did when I was an undergraduate at the start. So you need to get a balance between detail, argumentation, covering various things. But I think if you do most of the main things an essay should be doing, then you shouldn't be much less than 10 pages at least. if there is some issue, if there is some concern there, then obviously you should let me know and I can have a look at least at the draft stage or later, depending on how we go. Okay, so what do we need to be doing? Well, firstly, and all of you've done this in some way or another, the essay needs a subject. Now, we've been discussing this. You've mentioned it in class. You've prepared your little bibliographies and proposals, so that's okay. We've got a subject and we've agreed on that. Building upon that, some of you did this and some of you didn't do it quite so fully. Okay, the essay needs some kind of a problem or specifically a question. Okay, so it's not just, I don't know, write an essay about Henry III. And that's it, okay? Just something very open like that. There needs to be some aspect of, in this case, Henry III, which you're trying to understand or solve or find out more about, okay? So it's not just a simple descriptive narrative or whatever that might be, but it is a constructive thing where you're saying, here is a problem in relation to Henry III or Vikings or Battle of Hastings, wherever it might be, and I want to try and answer that, okay? So it's not just a sort of bang, 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 but there is something which you're trying to solve. Because what you're doing in the essay is taking the evidence, mostly from books and some articles, textbooks. For the most part, I don't think many of you are going to be reading primary sources, which we've been doing a bit in the course, but taking primarily your secondary sources, the books and articles, and using those, the evidence you get from those, to answer this question, okay? So that brings us to the third point here, is that you need some kind of a solution or answer, which obviously relates to what we might call your thesis, your argument, okay? You are presenting an argument about this, that Henry III was a strong king, or Henry III was a weak king, whatever the question is, you have to then try and present some kind of an argument. Now, because of the nature of what history is, and particularly the nature of medieval history, or ancient history or whatever, when we just don't have the level and detail of sources that we might like, it's sometimes actually not possible to come down definitely in a kind of black and white way for about a certain problem and say, this is the answer, this is what I think was true. Henry III was like this or like that or whatever. Sometimes you have a kind of gut feeling it was probably A rather than B, but you just can't prove it, okay? There's the evidence that you've got, whether it's from the secondary books or, more importantly, the way that historians work, from the primary sources, you just can't really prove it. And I've done some of my own work and published articles in the days when I had time to publish and so on, where sometimes I said, okay, I just can't really push it that far. I don't feel the evidence will allow me to go that far. I can make a suggestion, but I can't actually say this is definitely the answer. And that, in my opinion at least, is also a reasonable kind of a thesis. Okay? You don't have to necessarily say, here is my question, my problem, and David is expecting me to give a kind of 100% perfect answer or solution to that, because sometimes it's simply not possible, and then you have to make that point and explain it and indicate why to some extent in your essay. So we have subject, we have some kind of question or problem relating to the subject, and then obviously you need to find some kind of an answer, whatever that might be, to this issue. So this is our kind of starting point. This is the main point, and we should be at least up to that now. The bit which is often rather difficult is planning and structuring your essay. It's the fun bit sometimes. It's quite fun, I find. It's quite challenging to sort of decide, how am I going to move all these things around and create something? Because basically, this is your argument, your argumentation, shall I put here, okay, which is supporting, is the basis for your thesis, okay? So it's not enough to say, I think Henry III was a lunatic, and leave it at that. You have to then prove to me how he's a lunatic, and you have to prove to me how he had been a lunatic through a number of stages of logical argumentation and so on. You don't just come along with the evidence and kind of dump it there and say, okay, David, there's the evidence. You have to present it in a logical and organized way. And that's, as I said, both the difficult but also the fun bit, depending on how you look at it, okay? Now, in these days, I don't know how you all work. Being a relative dinosaur myself, going back to the days when I used to write essays by hand, because ordinary students didn't have computers, didn't have access to computers when I was an undergraduate. There were some strange people who sat in rooms with computers that we used to see when we walk into the library. And I'm thinking, who are those guys? And they were obviously computer science students or something like that. But the rest of us, it was kind of, that was another world and so on. So I was a handwritten guy. Now, obviously, the way I approach things, therefore, is partly determined by the fact that that's my kind of background. So I still do a lot of my work with pencil or pen and paper and planning and thinking. And only at a certain stage do I begin to put things onto the computer. I presume all of you young people, children of the digital revolution, whatever it might say, and so on, perhaps are more computer-based than I am. It has positive sides and negative sides. I find bits of paper are easier for me to relate to, but that could just be the way my brain is kind of fixed and so on. But the end product must be the same. Somehow you've got all this stuff that you've been reading and writing about and typing up, whatever it is. You've got to somehow organize this into a certain way. The computer can help you, or it might hinder you in a way. It depends on how you approach it. The one advantage you've got is, over me, and when I was an essay writer, is that I would sometimes spend a whole day writing up my essay from all the notes and research I'd done. And then right at the end, when I'd worked it all up and produced what I thought was a fantastic piece of work, right at the end, in the last paragraph, I'd have a new idea. And I'm not going to sit down and rewrite the whole thing. I haven't got time. I've got to give it in to the professor tomorrow or something. Where at least with the computer, you can obviously edit what you've got and change certain bits or whatever and so on in a way that I couldn't just stick bits of paper on and say, change this here. And so I was stuck with things. So there are advantages. And in a sense, perhaps you don't need to be quite so hung up about things as I was, because obviously the computer allows you to be a bit more flexible. Anyway, the point we're making is here you need to do your reading and your research, and I'm not saying much about that at this stage. That should be kind of more or less done. But then the planning and thinking about it, okay? Firstly, let's kind of go through this. Well, it's better call this A, otherwise we're mixing our subcategories and categories and so on. Your essay will need an introduction, okay? It needs something which introduces the subject, the problem, and even might briefly mention your thesis, might say, here is my argument, and so on. And as I often say to my undergraduate HIST students at this point, everything we do should have an introduction. Everything should have some logical introduction which then introduces and allows the reader, or whatever it might be, to know where they're going. Okay, just so when you set off on a journey, you say, okay, today we're going to wherever it is. At least that gives the person at the back of the car some sense of control of where they're going, and it makes it easier. And as I said, these points at least can be introduced in a very sort of basic kind of a way, and then that helps me to know where the essay is obviously headed. Parallel to that, you need to have some kind of conclusion, obviously. You need to have a proper finish to the essay. An essay isn't like one of those rock songs that kind of fades out and you can hear the musician still playing away, but the music is getting quieter and quieter or something. Essay definitely needs to be one of those songs that goes da-da-da-da and stops and everyone claps and so on. We don't want it to kind of fade out and so on. And a conclusion is quite important as well, because it's tying all this stuff together and showing that everything you've done has led to this thesis that you've perhaps introduced here. Also, in terms of getting points in a very, very practical way, it's worth bearing in mind the first thing that the examiner reads is the introduction. The teacher reads as the introduction. So that's the first impression, and first impressions are always very important. Oh, this sounds really interesting. Good idea. Let's see how it goes. And then 20 minutes later, half an hour later, the last thing they read is the conclusion. And that's also very important, because that's the thing which gives them the final kick before they decide on the grade. Okay? And the stuff in the middle obviously is extremely important. But so I'm not saying you don't put anything in the middle, but in a purely kind of practical way, you need to have a fairly good and well-written introduction, and you need a very clear and good conclusion. Okay? And that brings us to the body of the essay. Now, this is the difficult bit in a way. Having spent many, many years writing history things and essays and articles, and books and so on, I'm aware that every essay is unique, And how you organize the parts depends partly on the question, but also partly on how you want to approach it. There are sometimes 2 or even 3 possible ways to approach your essay. Now let's put poor Cengiz on the spot, because he's bravely given his essay in already. Now this is about the Battle of Hastings and the kind of military side. Can you just briefly tell us about, more broadly, what you're discussing in the essay? Can you tell us a bit more about the essay as a whole?
Basically, I'm trying to argue why the Normans defeated the Anglo-Saxons, and then focus on politics prior to the battle, which gave William an advantage, and then at the same time analyzing the battle and discussing the tactics and types of weapons used that.
Right, okay. So this is actually I'm glad I asked you, because this is quite a good example of what I'm trying to show now, which is that, to me at least, quickly thinking on my feet, literally, you could approach this in a purely chronological way, which is basically to trace the events through time, including the stages of the battle, okay? Or you can take it more kind of thematically, so that you may have already briefly sketched the events of the battle in a page or something, because you often need to do that so the reader knows more or less what's happened. But the kind of substantial and analytical part could be looking at, okay, let's look at the weapons of the Anglo-Saxons and the weapons of the Normans. And now let's look at some other aspect of the Anglo-Saxon army and some other aspect of the Normans, rather than kind of taking it purely in a chronological way. You can arrange those parts in a linear fashion, or you can move them around and try and connect things. You've got 2 parts here, because you've got the Normans on the one hand and the Anglo-Saxons on the other. And you can talk all about the Anglo-Saxons, armour, horses, tactics, and then you can talk all about the others and tell you the same things, or you can mix them all up. So can you see what I'm saying? There are all sorts of ways of approaching an essay, and there's no right or wrong way of doing it. It partly depends on the question, it partly depends on what you want to do and what your answer is, and so on. But sometimes the chronological approach is obviously the easiest one, just kind of A happens and we go through to B, to C, and then to the end. Sometimes in terms of actually putting your argument together, though it's more difficult, jumping around and doing the thematic approach might be better, but that's not 100% the case in every essay, okay? It all depends on what you're doing. Now, let me think. Fatih, you're the Irishman in the class. To be sure. Now, what were you... remind us again, what's your topic? What's your... right. Yeah.
Roman invasion to Ireland had the social and political and the structural or architectural things. And I first explained the political one, then not just chronological.
Right, yeah, different things. Politics, social society, and things like that, okay, rather than just going event by event and picking up on things. Okay, so that's again a kind of mixed or thematic approach, which for that kind of essay I think would definitely be better, okay, because the events themselves don't necessarily reveal certain things, though they reveal other ones and so on. So, okay, so here we have a number of points to bear in mind, and this is where pieces of paper in my case, or computers in yours, kind of come in handy, because then you can cut and paste and move things around and try different things out. But the best way is to kind of really think about it for a while, even go for a walk. I find walking in the fresh air kind of helps the brain to think about things, and then to say, okay, here's what I'm trying to do, and how am I going to actually put this all together? How am I going to put this all together in a way that creates, as I've said, a logical and convincing argument, which is the basis for your thesis. And that's partly what happens here, which is the substantial stuff, which is the big work, as we've said. And lastly, obviously, as I see Cengiz has got, you need to have your bibliography. You need to have a list of sources that you've used. You will also need to be referring to sources during the course of your essay, There are many different ways to do this, and I'm not going to say you must use the MLA as opposed to Chicago system as opposed to the so-called Harvard system with brackets and so on. I'm not going to worry about that. It's more the principle that you're referring to where you've got your ideas from, and if you've got quotations saying which page they come from and so on, then all those works and anything else you've read can appear in the bibliography at the end. Okay. If you've got any questions about these technical things, you can obviously send me a mail, or we can discuss them when I give you feedback to the draft. Now, lastly, and unfortunately, a majority of the sort of Bilkent undergraduates are not here to benefit from this little chat, but and I don't suppose this is going to go online for a while. They won't be able to watch the video version before handing in the last essay. But let's say a little bit about plagiarism, something I've become interested in recently from the librarian's perspective. But let's talk a bit about this now. Okay, what is plagiarism? Can someone tell me? I don't think anyone in this room will plagiarize, but let's discuss it anyway. Fatih?
If you write any information, for example, about this essay, and if you do not prove with a bibliography or with a citing selected references part that you taken the part the other author is written is good. So in other words, you should prove that you've taken the information from other sources.
Right, okay.
Before you have the sources and before you admit you have the admission of the essay, you have viewed it.
Yes, there's two sides. You've covered both of them here. There is the object, the thing which you're using, and then there is the way that you use it, the way that you present it, I suppose. You can plagiarize literally people's words, and of course this happens a lot these days because of the lovely internet, where we can just cut and paste lovely chunks of stuff and paste them in, and there it is, and you don't even have to do any typing yourself. And I've come across a lot of this in my time at Bilkent, though I'm sure no one here would do that. Or else there is what we call idea plagiarism, where you're passing off someone else's theory about Edward III or Henry III or whatever it might be as your own. Very different in the way that they appear, but basically the same, is that you're taking someone else's work, literal words or ideas, and then you're putting them into an article, an essay, or online, or whatever it might be, and you're implying or even stating clearly, this is my work, when in fact it isn't. It's someone else's idea that I've stolen, it's someone else's words that I've cut and paste, or whatever it might be. Now, the reasons people do these things vary. Some people just run out of time, so that it's just quicker and easier to plagiarize in one way or another than to do their own work and so on. I'm hoping that isn't the case here, because we've been kind of planning these essays for a while, and we're going to go through the draft stage as well, but it still might happen, and I hope not. Other times, people are just not really aware that what they're doing is kind of plagiarism. If you're cutting and pasting someone else's words, then I think obviously you're taking someone else's stuff, and the simplest thing is to put it in quotations with some kind of a reference to show where it's come from, okay? And if the quotation marks are missing, then and if there's no reference as well, as Fatih says, then that's definitely literal plagiarism, cutting and pasting and so on. So that's simple enough, okay? The problem here, okay, I'll come to this in a minute. Idea plagiarism is kind of at the other end of the extreme, okay? You can read things and then forget that you've read it from somewhere else, and the idea is kind of bubbling at the bottom of your brain, and you think, whatever, and you're not really plagiarizing because you're not consciously, deliberately copying someone else's idea, but it's floating around like a musical tune that you heard 10 years ago or something in the back of your brain and so on. So obviously we're not going to get too hung up about that, but in terms of our paper, your paper for me, you've been reading these things recently, so you know where you've got the ideas from, and if it's just a kind of suggestion about Henry III or whatever it might be, you just at least put a little reference at the bottom. I'm not going to be too focused on that. This is the kind of thing that I'll have my main eye out for Okay, and it's easier to spot in a way. Idea plagiarism, a little bit more difficult to spot, but well, I won't be worried too much about that at this stage. If you publish it and you put it out in the world, say, this is my theory, and you've taken it from someone else, and that's perhaps a little bit more serious. Now, the problem is that with the exception of Cengiz here, the rest of you in different ways, well, in the same way, but from different countries, are non-native English speakers. Okay, so English isn't your native language. You haven't been speaking and later on reading and writing in that language since you were very young and so on. And so I understand that it's not always easy to write perfect English. And you might be thinking, oh, if I give this in, David will think I'm kind of stupid or something because my English isn't very good or whatever. And then the temptation is, or it's just very difficult to take what you've got in front of you and change it into your words, to change it into something which is your wording. You might have a footnote saying this comes from this book, and what you're giving me is a bit too close to this, okay, in terms of the original words. And in these cases, it's simply not a matter of being a naughty boy or girl, cutting and pasting, but just that it's that bit difficult to take in a foreign language and turn it into something original. Okay? And that's true of all people, even native English speakers, even Cengiz and I, at a younger stage in our intellectual developments, when we were perhaps teenagers or something and writing work at school, will have gone through a similar problem phase of knowing how to kind of rewrite things in our own way and give our own stamp to it and so on. And how far do you go? And this is the point I was going to say here, is that some of my students say, okay, David, look, I can't really rewrite it, and the essay becomes lots and lots of long quotations with like a few comments in between. So there's no plagiarism going on because you've got your quotes, you've got your page number, but you don't really need a quote. It's not something very important. It's just another statement in the book. But people say, oh, I couldn't really rewrite that, so I'm going to put it in a quotation. Then I've got two sentences, then another quotation, and so on. And again, I don't take any points away from that because I understand the problems. And I just sometimes say to people, we need a few, rewrite some of these. This one quotation you might need, that's a more substantial comment by a famous historian about Henry III or something, but the rest of it is kind of not so necessary in a quoted form. You could have rewritten that and you can give it a try. Okay? And if I can see there's an attempt to do that going on. So this is quite a complicated issue. There's, again, it's not a black and white thing. It's not kind of good or bad. There are the whole grey area in between. I've come across the whites and the blacks as well as the greys in my time here. And these days, because of the internet, it's something which goes on all over the world. So this is why, in a sense, the draft stage will be quite important. Fatih?
Paraphrasing the information with the reference in parentheses is valid, right?
Yeah, that's perfectly okay. That's no, if it's paraphrasing, then you don't need a quote because it's not the original words. The problem is that for people who are still working on their English, and levels in Bilkent and even in the history department with our graduate students, levels vary a lot, is that some people can paraphrase, can rewrite quite effectively, and then they give their footnote saying, I got this idea from, or this information from so-and-so. Other people, what they give me is not exactly the same as the original, but it's a bit closer than perhaps it ought to be. And then those people sometimes think, well, I better put it in quotations and just give a complete copy of that page or something because I don't want to be accused of plagiarism. So there's that. That's the grey area, okay, which I'm aware of, and I know that it's a problem for non-native English speakers, in a sense, and things like that. If you're giving the exact words, you need a quote. If you're rewriting, you don't need a quote, okay? Do your best to rewrite it as completely as possible in your words, okay? Though obviously some of the same words, like, I don't know, sword, will have to come in. The guy used the word sword to describe the Battle of Hastings, and I can't find another word, saber or something. I'm not going to change every single word, go with a thesaurus and just have the word the being the same. Obviously, sometimes you have to just kind of move things around a little bit or whatever. Or, you know, if necessary, half a sentence can be quoted or something like that. But the most of it is as far as you can do is your reworking of that. Okay.
You guys don't have the plagiarism database here?
We do, yeah.
Our professors used to use that.
Yeah, no, I used it in the summer school, and we just had a whole session in the library about that. Turnitin is the one we have, which is the big one in the world, and so on.
It's crazy because there's so many papers in there that it's hard. I mean, it's like, our argument was always like, what if just coincidentally me and some other person happen to use the same words. I mean, when they're writing about the same subject, but I mean, it picks it out pretty
Well,
well.
yeah, it picks things out. It's a machine, so it picks things out in a very mechanical kind of a way. And yeah, in the summer school, sometimes the report for one of my HIST students was, that 20 plagiarized sources. And I thought, well, wow, I'll give the guy an A. He's used 20 sources. I'm sure that's not the case or whatever, that this material must have come from like one website, but the way Turnitin did it was to kind of jump at lots of places and things like that. That works with this kind of thing. It works with verbatim, literal reproduction of things, and with a certain flexibility. Things like idea plagiarism, or if you translate something from a Turkish book and then more or less just translate it into English but pretend it's your work, it won't spot that either and things. And it obviously focuses primarily on the internet, and a lot of the databases, the electronic journals are getting in there slowly, but they're not all there. So we did an interesting thing in the library recently where we did that. I gave one of my old conference papers from 10 years ago, and we processed that, and luckily that was 0% plagiarism, good boy. Then we submitted a draft of an article I'm writing with some librarians, and that was low plagiarism, except the bit where it just listed all the departments in Bilkent University. And I kind of copied that from the website, so that was quite good to see that had been detected, though I don't suppose anyone's worried about that. We then took some electronic journals, and some of them were spotted because they were obviously part of that database. Some of them were not, in a sense. But anything out there kind of on the surface internet, web, Google thing, that's going to get found straight away. Plus the essays that have been previously submitted by students from Ohio or wherever it might be, they're all in there as well, in a sense. For this course, because it's one of my graduate courses, I wasn't thinking of using Turnitin, okay? And to some extent, it takes longer, but I've got my own kind of methods and so on. But for my undergraduate course, where I've got 50 students, then I say, yes, submit it to Turnitin, and we see what happens and so on. Okay, so is that more or less clear? I mean, for those of you who are still working towards this and preparing your drafts for next week, if there's a problem with the drafts for next week, then you must let me know, and we must discuss it in advance. Is this more or less clear? These are the kind of stages, very roughly, that you need to go through.
I wrote the references, so I wrote the quotation marks, the information quotation marks, but the information that I quoted just from 2 books, but I used 5 in all essays. That's not, is that too less than I expected?
You mean 5 sources?
No, 2 sources to use.
You've quoted them in detail, and no. I mean, I haven't read the essay yet, so I don't know. I mean, there's no rule about this. So, I mean, it may be reasonable, because that might be where the substance is, where the main information is, and the others are providing you with context or something like that. And obviously, we don't have a vast collection of books on Irish history in Bilkent, but we have a reasonable one.
The other 3 books consider lots and lots of Irish and Gaelic names, so I didn't want to put them into the essay, or much of them.
Right.
So,
Yeah, well, that sounds okay. I mean, again, I'll look at the draft next week, and then I'll give you my feedback the week after. But it sounds okay to me. I don't think you need to worry about that. Any other questions? Any other points? No, but please don't hesitate to let me know if you need any help.
I guess we need to read the article too when we submit the draft to the journal article.
No, if it's in the bibliography, that's fine, okay, because I'll see it in the bibliography, and if I'm suspicious that it's not one of our electronic journals, I can check it quite quickly. So you don't need to print it out for me as well. That would be a waste of paper. It's bad for the Amazon rainforests and things like that. Okay, as usual, getting onto these things, I've kind of talked a long time. It's now, we have 15 minutes left. Any questions about that before we begin to think about poor old Henry III, who I've been defaming for the past half an hour or so? Okay, let's move on. So what I want to do now, for the next few minutes, is just introduce the reign of Henry III, and then after the break, Chara will do his presentation on the personality of Henry, and then we'll finish off the Barons' Revolt, the Civil War, and the documents relating to that, we'll finish those off on Tuesday. So I should send an email reminding people to make sure they read those documents for Tuesday next week. Okay, so who was Henry's father? John. Okay, so we'll have a simplified diagram here. Okay, and Henry was father of Edward, and Edward figures a little bit towards the end of his father's reign as well. We'll probably mention him a few times on Tuesday next week. Henry's reign is significant or interesting for a number of respects. Firstly, he ruled for a long time, over half a century. Okay, the vast part of the 13th century, politically, there was one king in England and Lord of Ireland and all the other things they claim to be and so on. Okay, so he ruled for a long time, and the reason is he became king, technically, when he was only 9 years old. Okay, so he wasn't one of these people like my beloved Prince of Wales now, who will be quite old when he succeeds to the throne of England at some point. His reign also interesting because this leads to what we call minority. What does that mean? What is, from a political perspective, what does as a minority, which you can see I've given dates for here. I'll come to that in more detail in a minute. I'm
just guessing, would it be if somebody's ruling as regent?
Yes. A minor, the Latin word means what? Small, okay, smaller. So it's a young person who is not of age, is not old enough to rule themselves, okay? I mean, my daughter is 7 years old, so yes, she could become, she'll be 9 in a year and a half's time, and obviously I love her very much, but I wouldn't want her ruling a whole country or something like that, particularly, although people were probably a little bit more mature perhaps in the Middle Ages, but obviously someone who's 8, 9, 10 or something is not really capable of holding the reins of government in a serious way, and so they are considered a minor, okay? They cannot inherit things. In this case, they cannot succeed and rule personally at that point. So you will have someone called a regent, often but not always, a close relative, a parent, the mother perhaps, or an uncle or something like that. Yes, well, yeah, or someone who will actually make a lot of the decisions for them, okay, because they want to go and be playing with their football or wherever it is rather than ruling the country. So his reign begins with this minority, okay, which was unique for this period, very important in English history. Secondly, also important because of the events have various. These events have various names. The Barons' Revolt, or sometimes called the Second Barons' Civil War, though that kind of overlaps with this. Towards the end of his reign, something not completely different from what happened to John is that the barons, the leading noblemen, or significant numbers of those, rebelled against the king and his government in various ways. The name most associated with that, and we'll be talking about him a lot on Tuesday, is a gentleman who was called Simon de Montfort, okay? And where we were talking about Magna Carta and the kind of important stage in the emergence of democracy, and we debated that a couple of weeks ago, Simon de Montfort and his boys, and some of the things they were trying to put into place, and he had quite extreme reform ideas for a while, okay, are seen also as kind of purveyors or initiators of sort of pseudo-democracy in this period and so on. And we see the development during Henry's reign and into his son's reign of the concept of Parliament. And again, we'll talk about that perhaps more on Tuesday and so on. So it begins with an interesting phase, and then the later part of the reign has rebellion and civil war and political change and so on as well. Interesting. And then the bit in the middle, because he's ruling for so long, is when he to some extent has his personal rule and he's building up his power and so on. And Chara and I were discussing this in my office yesterday. I think his personality, the way he ruled, the way he tried to rule once he'd come of age, particularly from 1227 onwards, was partly determined by the experiences he had. He lived as a young boy during the turbulent times of his father's reign, which must have been kind of difficult for someone and had an impression on him, and the early stages of his own reign must have had an effect upon him as well and built up his kind of public persona as ruler and so on. Okay, so let's take some of these events and describe them, put them into a context and so on. So we left the story kind of dangling. It's like one of those things where they stop the program and you think, oh, I wish I could still play. You've got to wait till next Saturday until it carries on. And King John dies, you know, of dysentery, some kind of food poisoning, we said. 18th of October, 1216. Now, what was the situation? Anyone remember what was the situation in England at the point when good or bad or whatever it is, indifferent, King John kicks the bucket? What is actually going on in England at that time?
I guess landlords are not for the situation that only the king have the power of administration, and landlords have just as right to have local government administration over their subjects, but they want to have more, so the Magna Carta issued because of that.
Yeah, okay, we'd had Magna Carta, we'd had the whole build-up to Magna Carta and all the implications that might have had, whether it's for democracy or whether it's for royal government and so on. And John, obviously to some extent unwillingly, had agreed to all that. Then things had broken down, partly because of him, as we said, partly because some of the barons wanted to go that much further. They were not quite happy with stopping at that point, and civil war had followed. Magna Carta, effectively at that point, was kind of null and void. It really meant nothing. So there was still a substantial number of landholders, powerful people in England who were in rebellion, fighting against King John. And what else was going on? Something else significant. Someone from another country is coming in. The French, Prince Louis, okay? And to some extent, I believe, perhaps even to some extent against his father's own wishes, okay? Philip Augustus, our old friend, but so the future Louis VIII, at this point still prince, had invaded England and is trying to put his own case forward to become king. And he is actually, he gets to London, he's supported by a lot of the English rebels, and he is, as it's always said in the books, he is proclaimed king, okay? But he's not actually crowned king. So he's never actually formally ordained and made into a king, but his supporters have proclaimed him king.
So would he have had his own lands in France as prince? I mean, that's where he would have had to raise this army.
Yeah. He's invaded with a bunch of French, and in fact, attempts to get more French. Yeah, no. I don't know exactly how his army was put together. He'll have had his own supporters and so on, vassals and things like that, and other people who would have perhaps joined in for fun. And there may have been a little bit of support from the king, but I don't think the king was too keen on this invasion, though his father had obviously made his own attempts in England before, as we've seen. But anyway, this is to some extent a kind of independent thing by Louis that's going on, because again, these young men are thirsty and hungry for power. We saw Henry II's sons fighting against him, and this is a better thing, fight against some other king rather than yourself, and so on. So we've got rebellion in England, and we've got invasion, and these two things partly working together by Louis and the French, okay? And then even effectively we have this proclamation of Louis as king. Within 10 days of his father's death, Henry is crowned king at Gloucester. Now the problem here is, as we said, firstly he's only 9 years old, okay, and he's in an extremely weak position. His father's dead, and he's 9 years old. He'll have some people around him, but he's obviously doesn't have his own army. He's not a charismatic figure that can press his claim or whatever. Fatih?
Who was coping with the complex situation in his region?
Yeah, I'm going to that now. Okay, so there is an important figure, very, very important figure during his father's reign, known as William Marshal. He was Earl of Pembroke, south-east Wales, and a very, very famous knight. He was quite old by this time, in his 60s or 70, early 70s or something. He's a very old guy, but very, very famous kind of chivalric and warrior figure in England. He'd been important as an advisor and so on with King John. And he was close to the royal camp in that sense. Now, the story goes, I don't know what the source is for this, how true it is, that at this point he didn't really want to get involved. Things get complicated. But then he sees this young boy, 9-year-old boy, and he takes pity. This is terrible. Someone has to protect this boy and to put forward his legal and true claim to the crown of England and so on. So he agrees to become regent, to look after Henry's case, and obviously that will be a big boost to have William Marshal, this famous knight and nobleman, sort of on their cause is very important. Okay, and how true the story about him not wanting to do it and things, it's quite a romantic story, but he definitely is kind of brought over to that camp. So he's the regent, he's the one that's kind of effectively leading the royal side at this point on behalf of the young Henry. To support his claim and to present the kind of legitimate side, okay, they reissue Magna Carta on the 12th of November. So it's published again with a few changes. For example, clause 61, the nasty one that we talked about last time about giving power to these guys and the king's powers being limited and so on, that gets left out. Whoops, we forgot to copy that one and so on. So it's a more kind of royalist document in a sense, but still they're trying to legitimize their case. They're trying to push themselves forward. Oh, yeah, and I should say, when he's crowned, the problem is Henry's coronation is also a little bit dubious. He's not crowned in London at Westminster Abbey, okay, because Louis and the French and the rebels have got London. The Archbishop of Canterbury is in Rome or somewhere else, or on his way to Rome or something. He's not in England at the time. So the Bishop of Gloucester agrees to kind of crown him. And they don't even have the real crown because King John accidentally lost it when he was running away from the French or something like that. I mean, the poor boy doesn't have a lot to thank his father for. So he's crowned with some kind of false crown and things like that, which is why later on, a few years later, we'll mention either now or on Tuesday, Henry is recrowned again in a more legitimate way. So his situation is quite weak. But they've got an army behind them, and now they've got the figure of William Marshal, and they're presenting their legal case by reissuing Magna Carta, as I say. And the papal legate, the representative of the Pope, is supporting Henry at this point as well, which is a very important point to make. So then we have the phase of continuing civil war of John's side, William Marshal, and other important figures against the rebel barons and the French. Initially, the French seem to do quite well, but more and more over time, as we move through 1217, the cause for Henry's side improves, okay? And that's because some people begin to see the French, who had previously had quite a lot of support, but see the French side as an invading side, okay? When you had bad King John and no one liked him, and the French were coming in, then that's kind of good. They've come to sort out this bad guy. But when you've got someone who is potentially a very good king and is a young boy, then these French look like kind of nasty foreign bullies coming in, and what do we want the French here for anyway, and so on. So that people begin more and more to support the royalist side as well. And as they may have more victories, then obviously that the momentum builds up and so on. So I've got a couple of dates worth mentioning here. In May 1217, a very important battle in Lincoln. Okay, William Marshal defeats the French and rebels, or whatever it is, in Lincoln. And a bit later on, in August of the same year, The French are trying to bring in, I think, some reinforcements from France, and there's a naval victory near Dover in the south of England. One of the places to sail to France from England is still Dover these days, so it's one of the closest points. This time, the Royalist forces, not under William of Marshall, but under another important figure, very powerful, important figure, Hubert de Burgh, who was Earl of Kent, which is that southern bit of England, and at that point he was also, had been for a while, Chief Justiciar. The Justiciar is what?
Grand Vizier is the judicial guy, and when the position is first founded, he just had an expert or a specialist about the topic, about the judiciary. He's not especially a judge, but a kind of a knowledgeable guy. And then, like a travel man, he goes around in Ireland.
Yeah, okay. It's, yeah, okay. The main point we're here is that the justiciar is the one who kind of is like the yardum of the king, help assistant of the king, and particularly if the king is not around, like when the king was in Normandy before, the justiciar would be the one who would keep things going, or when Richard the Lionheart was in on the crusade and so on. So it's an important position. It's kind of the second in power. The chief justiciar is the full title. And obviously even when the king's there, these people are, the individual has that title is very important as well.
What about exchequer?
That's a different office. We've talked about that before. That's kind of a, I mean, and the Chancellor of the Exchequer, whatever, you know, the Chancellor could have this office as well. It's an extra thing. It's a separate thing that be given to different people, and so on. Yeah, we've mentioned William of Marshall, and he has the victory in Lincoln. Other important figure, Hubert de Burgh, Earl of Kent, but also Justiciar, a very powerful figure, and he is the one that coordinates a series of naval victories during the summer there, okay, and defeats them. And finally, a month later in September, the French finally agree, Louis finally agrees to a peace. They sign the Treaty of Lambeth, Lambeth Palace, presumably in Canterbury is the one here, and he gives up his claim to the English throne. He says, okay, no, I'm not going to claim to be king anymore, and so on. And that's the end of this, technically that's the end of this civil war phase and so on. So then we reach the beginning proper of Henry's minority. Okay, we've gone slightly a few minutes over, but that's good. We've reached a kind of convenient cut-off point. So either if we've got time after Chara's presentation, or else maybe to give us all a break, from me, I'll wait till Tuesday. We'll carry on with the story of Henry's reign then. Okay, we'll have a break, so we'll start a little bit later then, start at 1:45, and then we'll move straight into Chara's presentation.